Two state troopers got out of the squad car, one in uniform and one in plain clothes. Both had little brown mustaches. When I went to unlock the front door, I noticed my hands were shaking badly. The two officers noticed as well and asked if I was all right. I stammered something about not having had a cigarette that day. Lighter, flint, something. The one in uniform quickly offered me the use of his own lighter. I lit up a cigarette right then and there. I noticed they both had blue eyes and were giving me the exact same expression of deep concern as I tugged on the smoke. Right then and there, I knew something absolutely awful had happened. The officer in plain clothes asked if there was any place we could sit down and talk, and said that I'd better lock up for a few minutes while we did so. I told the officers that actually, other than the stools in the viewing booths in the back of the store, the only option was the stool behind the cash register. As much as they certainly wanted some privacy for what was about to take place, neither wanted to go in the back of a store like mine. So we continued the conversation where we stood. The two officers started out asking me what seemed like several dozen questions about the home office in Waldorf. They wanted to know everything I knew about it. They wanted names and roles and rules and titles. They wanted to know when was the last time I had been up there. They wanted to know when was the last time I talked to anyone there. Then, they asked about my personal history. That got very uncomfortable for me. I don't see any reason why I have to answer questions like that. What I always do in situations where someone starts asking about my personal history is start out with my years in the Army. That's the first thing I want people to know about me, that I served. It turned out the plainclothes trooper was ex-Army as well, though a little younger than me. After that, I had to explain how I came to work in a place like this. If I'm being honest, it was a whole damn string of failures that led up to my then current state of employment. But that's nobody's business, and I conveyed only the bits and pieces the officers needed to know about all that. They both just kind of nodded and jotted stuff down while I did this. The plainclothes officer was surprised when he heard who my father was. Damn, they managed to extract a lot of information from me. I'm pretty sure I'm still considered a suspect in all this. They asked me about the typical course of business there at my store. I told them about the prompt and daily calls from Juanita. I told them how just this morning, sure as clockwork, Juanita had called me to verify I was in, and the lights were on. That is when the nature of the questions changed. The officers seemed like they needed me to say it 5 times and in 5 different ways that I had spoken with Juanita that morning, on the phone, and at what time. It was then that they told me Juanita had been murdered that morning, sometime right around 9 o'clock. It got worse. Much worse. Without going into too much detail, the officers informed me that the head manager and the owner, who had been in that morning for a meeting, were both also murdered around the same time. Of the 8 other people who also worked in that building in Waldorf, none of them had yet been accounted for. In the end, it would turn out that there were only 6 other people in that building, because 2 had called out. The remaining 6 are still missing persons cases to this day. I guess I am a suspect in those as well. The conversation needed to be continued at the police barracks, I was told. The troopers followed me around the store as I locked things up. They had to follow me into the back so I could lock the rear door. They each made a deliberate effort not to look to either side of them as they walked down the aisles. I understand. That stuff was all pretty awful, really. Made my stomach turn, to be honest. On the way over to the barracks, they pulled into a gas station. The plainclothes trooper got out for a minute and came back with a 3-pack of cheap plastic lighters for me. I was taken to the new barracks that apparently has just recently been built and was, or is, state-of-the-art. From the outside, it was a drab, but at the same time brutal-looking 1-story building. It had no windows. Inside, the new barracks was mostly one large room full of cubicles. There was a glassed-off conference room right in the middle. I had heard that they were getting computers in this new building. I do not know what I was expecting, but I was shocked to see there was one at almost every desk. They were just like these gray television sets with a bunch of wires coming out of the back. The screens did not look like anything out of Star Trek. They were black with glowing green letters. Each one had a keyboard and some kind of box for electronics beside it. There were several regular rooms with doors lining the outer walls of the barracks. I was taken into one of those. At first I got a little scared that they were taking me to a jail cell. But it was an interrogation room. There was an AC unit, and that thing was cranked up really high. I told the officers that I was cold, and they brought me a cheap, flimsy blanket. We all sat at a small table. The two officers wanted to talk more about Juanita. They started with almost the same exact questions they had asked me back at the store. I told them I knew basically nothing about her. I told them that, as far as I knew, Juanita's sole purpose was to make phone calls to make sure the stores were open on time. The company had the one store I worked at, two others in D.C. Well, actually right on the border with D.C., and one up in Baltimore. Someone else from the home office mailed me my paychecks. Someone else handled delivery of the inventory. I was just there to mind the place, work the cash register, and do bank deposits. The officers asked when I had first met Juanita. I told them I had met Juanita about 2 years ago when I first got hired, and was up in Waldorf to sign a bunch of papers. They asked how frequently I spoke to her. I told them again, twice a day, on the phone. They seemed pretty keen about that when I told them. They wanted to know what we talked about. I had to laugh at them at that point. I told them to look back over their notes, as I had already told them at least 4 times about the status calls. But the troopers said they just wanted to hear it from me again. That's all. They asked me why I left the job at the office supply store 2 years ago. They wanted to know why I was asked to leave the job at the power plant a month before that. They wanted to know why the teaching gig did not work out. I wanted to leave and walk out of the barracks at that point. I would be willing to walk all the way home, or hitchhike. These guys wanted to know about both my failed marriages. They wanted to know about my landlady, for crying out loud. But I also knew this was deadly serious business. People had died. I certainly did not want to antagonize the police by standing up and walking out. So I sat through all this and just took it. But I certainly didn't like answering all of their questions that had nothing to do with my actual job or about the murder case. My personal life was none of their damn business, and I don't like talking about it anyway. It is nobody's damn business. After another hour of this, I was getting to the point of walking out again. But then their questions circled back to Juanita. Was I involved with her? Had I been involved with anybody at the home office? No, I snapped at them. I hadn't been involved with Juanita or any of those people. They asked about my car. I told them I did not have a car, or a truck, or access to any automobile. I sold my old Sunbeam a while back because it was just too unreliable, and now I had no car. They got really interested to hear I had no car. They almost got kind of annoyed. Who doesn't have a car these days? They asked. How did I get to work? I lived how far from work, and I walked that far every day? Both ways? It was at that point that they both just stood up and left the room. I had to sit there wrapped in my blanket and stew for a couple of hours. When they came back in finally, they both thanked me very cordially and offered me a lift home. I was still mad at them, but accepted the offer. I left the blanket on the table and walked out of the room with them. I walked down the hall between them. Almost everybody else in the building had clustered in the center conference room. They were all packed around a conference table inside those big glass walls. Hanging in the air about a foot above the tallest person's head was a thick, bluish haze of cigarette smoke. They had all stopped whatever it was they were doing to look at me as I was being walked out. There he goes. There goes the guy who had something to do with it. They can all drop dead. I don't mind walking. I was in Army Special Forces back during Korea. We walked quite a bit back then. When I walked out of the barracks, it was dark, and I knew I was miles from home. But I told the officers to forget the ride, turned away from them, and started walking. I know they stood there and watched me while I walked off with my hands shoved in my pockets. I never once turned around, but I did not hear them go back in. Most of the county's roads out there are gravel over top of the sandy loam. This made it easy to hear the car coming up behind me from quite a distance. I could tell it was coming towards me, but at a slow, kind of pensive rate. I thought it was another squad car, so I just kept going without turning around. When the car pulled up beside me, it wasn't a squad car. It was a station wagon. Hey, I heard someone say. The voice was a little bit familiar, and I realized it was my one single customer from that wretched day. I don't know if he necessarily recognized me from the store or knew who I was. He made like he was just offering a fellow a ride. By the looks of him, I figure I didn't have much to worry about, unless he pulled a gun. So I climbed in. "Where you headed, fella?" he asked. I told him what road I was on. The cabin I rented had no actual street address, but if my driver got me to the entrance of the property, I'd be all right. "What do you do? Do you work at the base?" the man asked. I told him no. Then I just gave him the name of the bookstore. He, of course, acted like he had never heard of the place. Hear about those murders up in Waldorf? He asked. Yeah, I know all about it, I said, without really thinking about the conversation I was having right then and there. The car slowed in the middle of the road, practically to a rolling stop. Hold on, my driver said, propping one forearm on the top of the wheel. We were completely stopped, in the dark, in the middle of the road. Fortunately, there was no other traffic while this was going on. I turned to look at him. The brim of the trilby cast a shadow and obscured his face. The driver leaned over slightly. I could smell his breath. You say you know all about the murders that just happened in Waldorf? Do you mean, he went on, like you know about it, like you just heard about it on the evening news? Or you know about it? I exhaled. Working where I work, I hate giving out any personal details. But I had already stepped in it with this guy, so I just told him. I told him the office where the murders happened was my company's main office, and I actually knew the people. I told him I had just been talking with the state police all evening. I ended with, I'm helping them with their investigation. Ah, the man said. I see. He straightened back up and took his foot off of the brake. We drove on in silence. It finally occurred to me to ask him how the hell he knew about the murders. But a little voice in my head told me that somehow that was a terrible idea and to just get home. Here, I said, once we reached a gas station near my road. This is fine. Thanks. He stopped and said something like, all right. I got out and immediately walked towards the rear of the car, so he'd have no chance to roll down his window and speak to me any further. I turned as fast as I could onto the dark entrance to my road and walked it. The trail that led to the cabin was about a quarter-mile down from the main drag. I walked past the dirt driveway that went off to the parked trucks out in front of my neighbor's cabin. Then I sloshed through the wet carpet of damp fallen leaves that led up to my front door. Once inside, I remember lighting the fire because it had started to get a little chilly that evening, and I turned on the radio. I loved listening to that large, crappy radio during nights in that cabin. It got terrible reception out there, but I always left it on a classical music station. You can always make out the piercing beauty of classical music, even through radio static. Since all that happened, the media circus has come and gone. The case is still open, but so far there aren't going to be any trials. They never charged anyone. The old bookstore is now a boarded-up, rotting tooth in the middle of that strip of storefronts. It has been vandalized multiple times since the landlord had it emptied out. Absolutely nobody will rent that location. Kind of as a result of all the media attention this got, I met a woman who works at the college nearby. We started seeing each other for a while, but it didn't work out. I did, however, do a lot of work on her house while we were dating. After all, I was not working and was idle, and she needed a lot of stuff repaired. When we broke up, she decided it would be more of a clean break if she wrote me a check for all the hours spent on house repairs. That's why I've got my Sunbeam back beneath me again, with a fresh tank of gas in it. My clothes, my books, and the radio are all stashed in the boot. I'm leaving town today, leaving the whole DC area this time. I'm leaving the murder case, leaving the cabin, leaving my debts, leaving my reputation, escaping my father's orbit. Heading out west again, maybe back to Colorado. Maybe I'll patch things up there. But first I'm going to drive back into town. I'm going to park my car and walk back over to that stretch of sidewalk in front of the old store. I need to go over to that same exact spot, at that same exact hour and minute. I need to check the angle of the light. Try to figure out how it all happened. It has been 2 years to the day that the murders happened, and the weather is the same as it was that awful morning. I never told anyone about seeing Juanita that morning. I never shared that part, not with the police, not with anybody. I never told anyone how, right in the instant before she vanished, she raised her jaw just enough that I could see her neck. I never told anyone that the murder weapon was, unmistakably, a length of yellow Army-issue tripwire. Please like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. And as always, thanks for watching.